All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. My name is Todd Gonzalez. I'm a board member with the Flagstaff Festival of Science. I've been a board member for about 4 years with the festival. There's a lot going on. I hope you're all staying safe and at home and watching this virtually. Some of the things that we can get connected with, if you have little ones at home, I'm a teacher. I can't, state this enough, but if you have little ones at home that want to get involved, we have STEM kits out there at the libraries that you can pick up and do these activities at home. So if you're at the downtown library, we have them there until Friday, the 25th, from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then if you're at the East Side Library, they will be available for 2 more days on Friday and Saturday. And that will be for until 10 to 2. So you can get those STEM kits. They're fun space-based science kits that you can take home and do activities at home. So I have the absolute pleasure of introducing our next guest, who is a real bona fide archaeologist who specializes actually in anthropology. And he's been working at the museum as a research associate, well, a volunteer with the Museum of Northern Arizona as a research associate for about 10 years. And your expertise is pretty much focused on the Four Corners area of the United States. And so you're going to give us a wonderful virtual tour of the Old Caves Crater. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. or Dennis Gilpin.
So you want to say hi?
Okay, well, thanks, Todd. And I want to welcome everybody to our talk. This evening, I'm going to be talking about a site that I've been really interested in for about a year now, increasingly interested in, that's called Old Caves Crater Pueblo. I'm going to try to treat it pretty much like as if I were leading a hike to the Pueblo and then leading a tour, giving a tour of the site. But first, I want to go through a few preliminary observations and give you a little background about the site.
Sure.
Okay. Let's get this. Okay, I think that's got it.
I forgot to mention too, while Dennis is getting this pulled up.
Okay, here we go.
If you have questions, please go to scifest2020.org and put the questions under the live video. And you can send the questions in that way. Sorry, Dennis.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so Old Caves Crater Pueblo is probably the most visible site in the entire Flagstaff area. Most people get this view of it when they're driving up Highway 89. This is actually taken from a little bit west of Highway 89, but you see this large crater in the middle of the screen, and the bare spot on top of the, or near the top of the crater is Old Caves Crater Pueblo.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Dennis. Is there a way to make the slides full screen from your view?
I thought they were. Shoot, let me try. Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I have to go. I must have picked the wrong. I thought I picked the window I did before. Let's try this. How's that look?
That's perfect. Perfect.
Good.
Oh, terrific. Okay. So this is an aerial view of Old Caves Crater Pueblo, or actually the entire crater. The crater kind of runs, if you can follow my mouse arrow, this is the perimeter of the crater here. The high point, the summit, is right there. It's kind of open to the north and to the west. And this, again, this bare area right in here is the Pueblo itself. It was occupied from about AD 1250 to AD 1350. And it has probably 50 or 80 Pueblo rooms on top, and then more than 50 Caveate features. And the word Caveate is an archaeological term that refers to a chamber, a cave-like chamber that was actually excavated or dug into the bedrock. And Caveate features occur in places like, well, the Verde Valley, here in the Flagstaff area, and over in New Mexico at Bandelier National Monument. Old Caves Crater Pueblo probably had about 150 to 200 residents. And it's important because it was the largest and the last Sinagua village in the Flagstaff area. Second, it has that Caveate architecture, which is unusual here in the Southwest. And finally, the Hopi and other descendant communities consider Old Caves Crater Pueblo to be an ancestral village and one of the footprints of their ancestors. This slide gives you a little information about where Old Caves Crater fits in the overall culture history of the Flagstaff area. From about AD 600 to the eruption of Sunset Crater, which occurred between about 1064 and 1085, roughly. People in the Flagstaff area and in Doney Park lived in pit houses, which were earth lodges or dugout type features that were basically a hole in the ground with a roof on top. These pit house dwellers generally lived in clusters of maybe just a few pit houses that represented, say, a family farmstead or an extended family farmstead or a small hamlet, but they participated in community-wide ball games. And there are two ball courts in the Doney Parks area, one at the base of Old Caves Crater on the south side, and another just to the west of Old Caves Crater that's called the Doney Park Ball Court. After the eruption of Sunset Crater, people slowly transitioned into building pueblos as opposed to pit houses. And some of the sites that most people are familiar with, like the Picture Canyon sites, Eldon Pueblo, Walnut Canyon, and Wupatki, are all pueblos that were built after the eruption of Sunset Crater. And you see here, Old Caves Crater Pueblo is right at the end of that period. When Old Caves Crater was first founded, Eldon Pueblo was still being used to some extent. And there was another site called Turkey Hills Pueblo that was occupied, and it's sort of at the south end of Doney Park. But other than that, you had to go quite a distance to find other Pueblo communities. You had to go south of 30 to 40 miles to Anderson Mesa, where there was a cluster of about half a dozen pueblos, or you had to go to the Verde Valley, 50 miles away, where it was still being occupied, or you had to go east 50 miles to the Winslow area, where the Homology sites were being occupied, or all the way, say, 75 miles to the northeast to get to Hopi.
Just use that.
Okay. Here's an aerial view of Old Caves Crater Pueblo. And what you see here is this grid-like pattern. And those are the collapsed walls of the Pueblo that was up on top of that crater. Each one of those little grids represents a room. And beneath each room, or within most of the rooms, there was actually one of these Caveate cellars that people dug into the bedrock beneath the room.
Oh yeah, that worked.
And then now this is that bedrock material that people dug into. And when you read a lot of popular accounts of old caves, people will describe the caves as being natural features, caves or lava tubes. One account in a hiking guide said that these are actually volcanic gas bubbles. But in fact, these are not natural features. They are excavated, constructed features that are dug into this matrix. And John Wesley Powell called it an indurated and coherent cinder mass. Jesse Walter Fuchs described it as a conglomerate of cinders or volcanic breccia. And Flagstaff volcanologist Richard Holm described it as a deposit of large volcanic particles or volcanic bombs. And this is actually, it's really hard, but it's crumbly. And so it makes it, made it possible for people to actually dig into that and construct these caveate chambers. And you can really tell that these are man-made structures when you look at the kind of the uniform and the regularity of them. You can see that they're well-shaped. This is a vertical entryway that goes into it, and it's sort of a keyhole-shaped entryway. Here's another one where you've got sort of a vestibule that's kind of square or rectangular. And then there's a almost perfectly circular tunnel that goes into the chamber like this. And you see a nice flat floor and a small little storage bin that's been excavated into the wall of this feature, this chamber. Scientists first got interested in Old Caves crater back in the late 19th century, in the late 1880s, when the Smithsonian sent out 4 groups of people to examine the site. On the left here, you see John Wesley Powell, who of course people remember as leading the first expedition to boat the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. And in 1879, Powell established the Bureau of American Ethnology to study the ethnology of the United States. And he sent out a huge team of people to study the Southwest. One of the people he sent out was this James Stevenson, who came to Old Caves Crater in 1883. And that was just 2 years after Flagstaff was founded and 1 year after the railroad arrived in Flagstaff. Then in 1885, John Wesley Powell joined Stevenson in a visit to the site. And Powell ended up writing two brief accounts that were published in Smithsonian publications that described Old Caves for the general public. A few years later, 1887, these two brothers, Victor and Cosmos Mendeleev, visited the site. Victor was an architect that John Wesley Powell hired to study the architecture of the Pueblos, specifically Zuni and Hopi. And he authored this brilliant study called A Study of Pueblo Architecture. His younger brother Cosmos was a field worker primarily, but he authored studies of Canyon de Chelly, the Verde Valley, Casa Grande Ruin, and Navajo Hogans. And unfortunately, both brothers proposed additional work at the site, which they never completed. And neither one of them ever actually wrote a full-scale report on the site, although Cosmos discussed it a little bit in his report on his Verde Valley study. In 1896, Jesse Walter Fuchs came out, and people may know of Jesse Walter Fuchs because of his work at Mesa Verde. In the 1920s, Fuchs actually returned to Flagstaff, and he's the one who dug Eldon Pueblo. But in 1896, when Fuchs came out, he was working in the area around Homolivy. He worked in the Wapatki area, and he spent a little time at Old Caves Pueblo. And at that time, there were still standing walls at the Pueblo, as you can see here. He did some excavations in one of the Caveate suites Here you have actually two chambers. This is map of the suite. You had two main chambers, A and B, and then chamber C was a much smaller chamber that was probably a storage facility that could be accessed from either chamber A or B. Both of those chambers you entered through the roof, as you can see there. And then you have these small little niches or alcoves, D, E, and F, that were, again, probably used for storage or something like that. And both D and F had ventilator shafts that connected the subterranean chamber with the outside surface so that you could bring in some air into the chamber. This is another one of the chambers at Old Caves that Fuchs photographed. This one is more like a rock overhang. And over on the right-hand side, you can see the edge of a wall that would have been one of the side walls of this building, or this Caveate chamber. And then you can see rubble running across the front of it. That is the collapsed remnants of a stone wall that would have covered the front of the Caveate. And then in the back, you can see, again, some of these small little shelves or storage bins that are so common in these Caveate chambers. Here's another a pair of these small little storage bins. And one of the things that Fuchs noted at the time, you can see how smooth the walls are, and that's because they're plastered. And at the time when Fuchs was working there, he could still see remnants of plaster, and he felt like that the floors and the walls and the ceilings of all of these chambers were probably plastered. In 1922, the Milwaukee Public Museum came to Old Caves Crater, Pueblo, and a guy named Samuel Barrett was the director of that expedition. And he excavated a small suite of rooms. He's shown in the entrance of one of those rooms in that suite. Here's another picture of other members of the expedition in the other entrance to that suite of rooms. And you can see the 1922 photograph and then a 2020. This is what it looks like today. It's clearly the same one. And I swear every time I look at these old photographs of people, I'm struck by how much the dress code deteriorated in the time between these pictures and when I first started doing my archaeological field work in the 1970s. Here we have Harold Colton and Mary Russell Farrell Colton, who of course were the founders of the Museum of Northern Arizona. They founded the museum to actually preserve sites like Old Caves Crater, Pueblo, and to make sure that collections from Old Caves Crater, Pueblo, and places like that actually stayed here in the Flagstaff area. Colton wrote two descriptions of Old Caves Crater, Pueblo in his 1932 report and in his 1946 report. And I'll mention those a little more later. Even as the scientists were working at Old Caves, the pot hunters were also attacking the site. There was a guy named Dad Power who arrived in Flagstaff in 1888. And in 1919, the Coconino Sun, which was a forerunner of the Daily Sun, published one of his reminiscences. And of course, as I said here, you could pick up lots of curiosities there. I sent a whole box full of handsome trinkets to Michigan. And who knows where those are today. Platt Klein, who is a Flagstaff historian, says that Colton told him that Ben Doney, after whom Doney Park is named, was an inveterate pot hunter, and by 1900 had amassed a huge collection of prehistoric materials. This doesn't specifically mention Old Caves Pueblo, but I feel fairly certain that it was one of the sites that Ben Doney attacked. Then there was a Mr. Ivans of Milwaukee who actually preceded the Milwaukee Public Museum to Flagstaff, and he discovered, or didn't discover, but he was led to the Pueblo and collected 3 pots and a sandal from the suite of rooms that he later took Samuel Barrett to, and where they ended up conducting their excavations. And then in 1932, Harold Colton pointed out that the Old Caves was unique in Pueblo architecture, and he thought it should be preserved from pot hunting. And he also said that it should be declared a national monument. Some of the pot hunters who were working in that same era that Colton was talking about were Joe Babbitt and Lloyd Bowles. Joe Babbitt was one of the sons of one of the 5 Babbitt brothers who came to Flagstaff in the 1880s. And Babbitt collected and pot hunted at a lot of sites over east of the San Francisco peaks. But he kept notes on where he was digging. And so when his collection was donated to the Museum of Northern Arizona in 1981, we actually got pots that we can say where they're from, and they do include some pots from Old Caves. Lloyd Bowles was Babbitt's employee. He also dug with Babbitt, and his collection went to Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And again, we know of several pots in that collection that we can trace back to Old Caves. Unfortunately, by 1946, Harold Colton said that pot hunters have subsequently wrecked the site and excavated an intensive burial ground. And that pretty much ended any archaeological interest at the site. And I think archaeologists, to some extent, have kind of written it off as being a lost cause. So I'd like to start our hike. To get to the site, you actually you go up Highway 89 to the north, about 3 or 4 miles north of the Flagstaff Mall, and you turn right or east on Silver Saddle Road and go about half a mile, and there's a nice parking area there and this informational sign that tells you how to get to the site. The first, it's about a mile from the parking area to the top of to the site itself, and it's about a 600-foot climb. You follow signs like this that say Crater Summit. Initially, you're going through Ponderosa Pine Forest. Here you have a juncture between the Crater Summit Trail and a loop trail, but you continue on the Summit Trail. And at this point, you start climbing about half a dozen, well, actually 5 switchbacks. And I encourage people to follow the switchbacks. This is an example of where people have cut the switchbacks, which of course causes erosion and can ultimately result in the destruction of a trail. So please stay on the switchbacks. While you're on the switchbacks, you're actually walking through pinyon and juniper woodland. And that's kind of interesting because usually pinyon juniper woodland is at a lower elevation than the Ponderosa Pine Forest. And here it's reversed because you're on this west-facing slope that gets a lot of direct sunlight. So it's a little drier. And in a way that's kind of advantageous for or would have been advantageous for the residents of Old Caves Pueblo, because the pinyon juniper woodland has a lot of plant foods like pinyon nuts and juniper berries, and a lot of plant resources that are valuable for making, construction or making various implements. Things like juniper bark that's used for any number of things. Whereas the Ponderosa Pine Forest is really kind of a food desert. And it's kind of it really doesn't provide nearly the kind of resources that the pinyon and juniper woodland provides. Continuing up the switchbacks, this is in June when the Apache plume was blooming. You get to see, some nice plants along the way. And it's kind of fun while you're making that climb, I think, to try to identify as many plants as you can and sort of try to figure out how those might have been used by the residents at Old Caves Crater Pueblo. When you get to the saddle, you have a choice of going to the left to climb to the summit or going to the right to visit the Pueblo itself. And as you climb up to the Pueblo, between the saddle and the Pueblo itself, you get your first vistas of Doney Park. And it's, I think, important to kind of look out on that and think of that as being the location of the farm fields of the residents of Old Caves Pueblo. That area would have been a wet meadow at the time that the Pueblo was occupied, which meant that the soil moisture would have been too high for ponderosa forest to grow there, but it would have been good for planting corn and beans and squash. They get plenty of enough rain to grow those crops in that area, but of course the winter, the growing season, is really quite short, and so it's kind of marginal from that standpoint. Also, as you look out across Doney Park, you can see Turkey Hill here, and that's where Turkey Hill Pueblo was. Eldon Pueblo is just to the right of the field of view here. You can see Mormon Mountain in the background, and then the long, low horizon there is Anderson Mesa, and that's where the cluster of 6 prehistoric pueblos that were occupied contemporaneously with Old Caves, that's where they were located. So this is Harold Colton's map of the site. And I should point out a few things. First of all, there's this large plaza here, right on the top. There's also this, what looks like in Colton's plan, just a huge mass of rooms. But in fact, I feel like you can identify 4 different Pueblo units on the ground. There's a 2-room unit right here, southwest of the plaza. There's what I call the western room block that's over here, the southern room block that extends down like this, and then this area is the eastern or main room block, as I identify it. And you can see that those circles are all represent vertical entryways into cellars. You also have some sort of standalone, these little curved lines here and down here are standalone Caveate dwellings. Today, when you visit the site, I think the Caveate cellars are not nearly as visible as they were in Colton's day because they've all been filled in, but the Caveate, the standalone Caveate dwellings are quite a bit more visible. What I would do as I'm leading the tour is to go first to the plaza and look at that, and then walk along this group of 5 Caveate dwellings in front of, or on the south side of the plaza, then go over to the western room block, and then continue down this arc of Caveate dwellings and across to these over here, and then work our way back up the slope past the southern room block and the eastern room block. Before we go, I should mention a little bit about site etiquette. First of all, please don't pick up, don't take artifacts, and don't deposit artifacts in piles like we see here. It's certainly fine to pick up artifacts, examine them, photograph them, make drawings of them, but leave them where you find them. First of all, because they do provide information on the site. Even after all these years of pot hunting, we can still learn some stuff by studying these artifacts. And second, descendant communities view these artifacts, just like the site itself, as footprints of their ancestors. And so it's really important, I think, to treat them with respect. A second recommendation I make when you're walking around the site is to watch where you step and try not to dislodge any rocks, primarily because those rocks very often are collapsed. They're the rocks that were used to build the walls. And in some cases, they actually provide evidence of where the walls were. So it's important to watch your step as you move about the site. So here's the plaza at the site. It's right on the crest of the ridge. It's like the flattest place on the site, and this is where the ceremonies and communal gatherings for the Pueblo would have been held. You can see this basalt rubble in the foreground, and this is what's left of the stone wall that surrounded the site. There was a stone wall on the south side, the east side, and the north side. And then on the west side, as you can see, just behind that little tree, there's a rubble mound that was a two-room building. And we don't know whether that was a residence or if it was some sort of a building where ceremonial activities related to the plaza might have occurred. Another important thing about the plaza, I think, is that it has a phenomenal vista. You can look to the east and see the Cinder Hills, look to the south and look all the way down to Anderson Mesa and Mormon Mountain. You look to the west as we are here, and you can see Mount Eldon. To the northwest, there's the San Francisco Peaks. To the north, there's O'Leary. And only to the northeast, where you have the summit of Old Caves Crater, is the view in any way obstructed. And it's kind of important, I think, that from the beginning, the very beginning of the founding of this Pueblo, that the people, the residents of the Pueblo, and the people who planned it and built it, reserved this area as public space for them to hold their ceremonies and their public activities. If you go south of the plaza, you come across 5 Caveate dwellings. And on the left, you can see what this Caveate dwelling looks like today. And you can see the rubble of the south wall of the plaza. In the 1922 photograph, you can see that the wall was still somewhat standing. And so that kind of gives you a sense of some of the deterioration that has occurred at the site over the last century. One of the caveates that you can see along that row of 5 is the suite that Jesse Walter Fuchs examined in 1896. And this is the eastern entrance, or the western entrance, into that caveate suite. This is one of these keyhole-shaped entryways. It's vertical. You drop down into the caveate chamber beneath, and you can see the entryway here that leads into the small chamber that Fuchs described that would have been a storage facility. Then to the right, you have an entryway or a passageway that goes into the eastern caveate, the eastern chamber of that suite. This is looking into the eastern entryway, into the eastern chamber of the caveate, and through that passageway, and you can see the sunlight falling through the western entryway into the floor of the western caveate dwelling. And this is what it looks like on the inside, standing in the, or sitting in the eastern caveate and looking through the passageway into the western caveate. If we go to the west, just really a few yards, you get to the western room block. And as low as these walls are in this photograph, this is actually, these are some of the best walls, best preserved walls on the site today. This is about a 6-room block of rooms. There was 2 rows of 3 rooms each. And you can see alignments like this in this area and a few other places on the site. This is what we call double simple masonry or double course masonry sometimes. Single course masonry or simple masonry is just a single row of rocks. Double simple or double course masonry is 2 rows of rocks. There's a type called compound masonry that's basically 2 rocks wide and that has some of the larger blocks actually extend partway across between the 2 rows of rocks to provide sort of an interlocking arrangement. And then there's finally the core veneer masonry where you have 2 rows of rocks, but the rows are separated by a space in which people put in earth and rubble to provide some more support to the wall. And the style of masonry that people use is kind of based on the materials that are available to them. It's kind of based on whether they want to go to a single story or multiple stories. And it also, I think, reflects the architectural tradition in which they were trained. And at Old Caves, virtually all of these rock bases, these stone wall bases, are double-coursed, double simple masonry, which to me suggests that they had a common objective and they had all learned their architectural construction as part of a single tradition. So you didn't probably have very many migrants coming in and introducing any new styles of masonry. There are 2 Caveate cellars that are still visible in the Western Room block. There's one that's a side entry that's kind of blocked and filled with debris now. This is an open one that's a vertical entry that drops down into a Caveate cellar that's several meters in diameter, like 10 feet in diameter. If you go further west and downhill from the Western Room block, you get to that arc of Caveate rooms or Caveate chambers that I was describing when I showed you Colton's map. And you get a real sense of the variability in these Caveate features. In this case, what you have is a floor, just a simple floor where they dug straight down 2 or 3 feet through the bedrock, the crumbly bedrock, and leveled out a floor that measures about 15 feet by about 10 feet. And then in the middle of the floor, they dug this vertical entryway into a Caveate chamber that's underneath this room. And then there would have been, stone walls and a roof put over the whole feature. Further south along the arc of Caveate rooms is this series, this suite of rooms, which is the one that was excavated by the Milwaukee Public Museum. And here you can see at the top of the slide, there's the side entry into the northwestern chamber. Then sort of in this area, this is a very small ventilator or skylight that goes into the central chamber, which can only be accessed from the northwest chamber or the southeast chamber. And then here in the foreground is the entry into the southeast chamber. This is the little skylight or ventilator hole that leads into the central chamber. And this is a view from the interior of the northwest chamber looking into the central chamber. And you can see where the light is streaming through the little skylight or the ventilator hole and shining on the floor of the central chamber. And then in the far background, you can see the southeastern chamber, and you can see that that's actually at a lower level than the floors of the northwestern and central chamber. So this was kind of a split level suite of rooms. This caveate, which is a little further down the slope, is I think the one one of the ones that Fuchs photographed, not the one that he excavated, but one of the ones where I showed you a photograph, where it was sort of an overhang with a little storage bin at the back there, or a shelf, something like that. And then you can see on the sides, you can see the stone walls that would have been the side walls of the building, or the caveate chamber. And then in front, you can see a line of rubble that would have, that's what's left of the wall that would have walled up the front of the building. Here's a small little, tiny little caveate entrance. And if you go inside, you can see that there's a tunnel leading out the back of it. And I haven't actually gotten down on my stomach and looked and shined a light to see where that tunnel goes. And then to the left of it is another one of these little recesses that was probably used for storage. So from the base of the Pueblo, and where we finished our tour of the arc of caveate rooms, I usually like to make my way back up the slope to the past the eastern or main room block and that southern room block. And here you can see that the main east room block is really a mass of rubble. And it's kind of hard to see walls or rooms in this thing, but once in a while you can actually make out, as you can here, the outlines of rooms. You can also, as you head up there, you'll come across various caveates. This is a standalone caveate dwelling, and it's one that I actually showed from a different angle. It's another one of these keyhole-shaped entryways that drops down into a standalone caveate dwelling. This is a caveate cellar. It's a side entry into a caveate cellar. Here's another side entryway into a caveate cellar, which I put this one in just because it's such a nice rectangular, well-shaped entryway. As you go across the site, you'll end up seeing, I'm sure, quite a number of artifacts are really quite common on the site. And once again, I urge people to examine them, photograph them, draw them, but leave them in place. This is the most common type of pottery found on the site. It's called Alameda brownware. It's a plain brownware. It's the type of pottery that the Sinagua archaeological culture made. And it's what you'll see most commonly on the site. Sometimes if you flip it over, you'll see that the inside is smudged black. Another type of pottery on the site is San Francisco mountain grayware, which was made by the Kohanina, who lived between the San Francisco peaks and the south rim of Grand Canyon, and as far west as Sitgreaves Mountain to the west. This would have been imported. There actually was a Kohanina colony between Sunset Crater and Wupatki at one point. So this didn't travel very far, but it's not nearly as common on the site as Alameda brownware. The Sinagua did make a corrugated pottery type called Eldon corrugated, but most of the corrugated pottery that I've seen at the site is, it actually comes from the Caveate area, which is like 100 miles to the northwest. All of the painted pottery that you see at the site, and there's not a lot of it, but you will see it. And all of that is imported because none of the Sinagua did not make painted pottery. This particular type is called Luke black on white. It dates from 1200 to 1250. And if you look at the right edge of it, you can see how dark that is. and then it has a white slip on it, and then they painted on that white surface. And that means that it was manufactured in the Hopi Buttes area, about 50 miles to the east of Flagstaff. This is called Tusayan polychrome pottery. It dates from about 1125 to 1250. It has a red paint on an orange background, and then they've outlined the red paint with black. This is Keatsil polychrome, which dates from about 1250 to 1300. And it's a black design on a red surface outlined in white. This is the only projectile point I have found on the site in my wandering around. It's made of obsidian, though, and there's a lot of obsidian flakes on the site. And probably all of that obsidian comes from the government mountain source, which is west of the San Francisco peaks. And in this period when Old Caves was occupied and the Anderson Mesa sites, those half dozen pueblos down there were occupied, they controlled the government mountain obsidian source, and they traded that to places like Homology at Winslow or the Hopi Mesas. And it was probably the major export of the Sinagua people at that time. You'll also see some little flakes of material. This is a chert that, and these are also imported to the site. And the early explorers said that there were lots of grinding stones on the site, as well as polished stone axes. Today, I don't see very many grinding stones on the site. This is one example. I have never found a polished axe, but you can see this is a matate, a grinding stone. They would have put the corn on this and then smashed it with a hand stone or a mano, and then ground it into cornmeal. Some of the other types of artifacts that have been reported from Old Cave pueblos include a sandal that the Milwaukee, one of the Mr. Ivins found a sandal and apparently didn't give it to the Milwaukee Public Museum because they don't have it. But the fact that there was a sandal there indicates that perishable materials were present at the site. There's a wooden bird effigy, bone awls and needles, shell beads and bracelets. There's a turquoise bird pendant, ear bobs, beads, and scraps of turquoise that are left over from processing turquoise. And there's a mosaic, and all of these are in the Babbitt collection at MNA. Finally, I want to mention the last days of the Sinagua. This is the question of why did they leave and where did they go? Certainly one suggestion has been that there might have been violence and warfare. The fact that Old Caves Pueblo is built on a summit of a mountain suggests that it might have been built there for defense. It was certainly very isolated at the time that it was founded. At the time it was founded, there was Turkey Hills Pueblo was still being occupied. Eldon was still being occupied. And then another site 4 miles to the east, New Caves Pueblo, was built very much like Old Caves up on the top of a volcanic cone. And so Old Caves and New Caves are built in defensive positions, but they're not burned sites. And we don't really have any evidence from human remains at all from either of those sites. Sometimes human remains can tell you if there was violence because you get evidence of trauma on them. So we don't have that kind of evidence that demonstrates that there was violence at the end, but there is this kind of hint that they felt the need to locate in a defensive location. The second idea of where they might have, or why they might have left is climate change. The precipitation based on the tree rings does not seem to indicate that there was much drying at that time, but it does indicate that after about 1325, there was a fairly lengthy period of colder temperatures. And given the sort of marginal growing season at Old Caves and in the Doney Park area, I think that might have been a cause for them to leave. And the other possible explanation for why they left is the fact that places like Homology were really booming at that time, and the Hopi mesas were also really booming. They're slightly better in terms of agricultural potential, and people were recognizing that and moving to those places. And so it might have actually been the attraction of those distant places that caused people to leave Old Caves. When you return, you can either go back the way you came, it's about a mile, or you can actually go over the summit of Old Caves and back down the other side and take the loop trail back around. That's about a 2.5 mile hike. And in either case, I remind you, please don't cut the switchbacks. Finally, I had a lot of people help me with this, this presentation. I really appreciate it. Here's a list that lets you know just how many people pitched in on this, this presentation. So that wraps it up for me, I think. And if there are questions, I think we've got a few minutes. We could probably.
Yes, thank you so much, Dennis. That was a great talk. So we did have a few questions that came in. First, Lisa from Flagstaff wanted to know, how involved are the local tribes in the archaeology of the area?
Very much so. Like the Navajo tribe has its own historic preservation program. The Hopi, well, all of the tribes have their own historic preservation programs, and they consult with museums, they consult with federal agencies, and federal agencies are required to consult with the tribes whenever there's any kind of, say, proposed undertaking, some sort of construction project that involves federal funds or federal land or a federal permit. The federal agencies consult with the tribes. I know the Museum of Northern Arizona works really, really hard to invite tribal representatives and tribal members to come view their collections, familiarize themselves with their collections, help in developing museum exhibits. And so the tribes are very, very, very involved in the archaeology of this area.
Awesome. You know, I know I had a question too that, you know, students of mine would probably be very interested in. You mentioned ball courts on either side of Old Caves Crater. Maybe you could explain a little bit more about what those are. I mean, what evidence do you have that, you know, that these are indeed ball courts? Are we talking about balls for games or for dancing or rituals?
Yeah, the ball courts were a, gosh, they're basically sort of subrectangular oval spaces with berms on either side. They're, oh, I guess I'm trying to think. They're the size of them. They're a. I'm trying to convert from metric to English in my head. They're like 75 meters long and 25 meters wide, so that's 75 feet wide and 200 feet long, roughly. Again, they have berms on either side. The one at Wupatki actually has masonry berms, masonry lined berms. And in excavations at Snaketown down at, which is a Hohokam site down south of Tucson, they even found south of Phoenix, excuse me, they even found an actual rubber ball that was used in the game. They probably also used, other types of balls, and there are a variety of different ball games that were used throughout Mesoamerica that we have a fair amount. We have more evidence for the way the ball game was played in Mesoamerica because there are depictions of it in codexes and in art. But we interpret we interpret the ball courts up here based largely on what we know about the ball courts in Mesoamerica. And these are much simpler than the ones in Mesoamerica, but we do think that they actually played perhaps several different kinds of ball games in these courts. Some people have actually suggested that these were also dance courts as opposed to ball courts. I think that the general consensus is that these in fact were places where various types of ball games were played.
Oh, very, very cool. A couple more questions for you. Are there any plans for future excavations at Old Caves Crater?
Actually, there are not. Generally speaking, here in the Southwest, well, all over the country, most archaeological excavations today take place at sites that are threatened by construction. And archaeologists and descendant communities feel like that's the very best use of archaeology, is not to disturb sites that are not imperiled by construction, but devote our efforts to sites that are imperiled by construction. I will say that we have seen some excavations in recent years at sites that were either previously excavated or pot hunted. For example, the Homology sites over near Winslow were extensively pot hunted, and yet they were turned into a state park, and the Arizona State Museum developed a very constructive and productive research program to conduct excavations at the Homology sites with the participation of the Hopi tribe. By the same token, Eldon Pueblo was excavated almost completely excavated by Jesse Walter Fuchs in the 20s, and Coconino National Forest and the Arizona Archaeological Society, the Northern Arizona chapter, spent a number of years reworking those excavations and making some really nice new discoveries. So it is possible to design excavations there. It is something that is a possibility, but it would, entail obviously the cooperation of descendant communities, and I think it could prove to be an actually very productive and very informative pursuit. But there's no plans at the moment.
Okay. And last question, could you explain, you mentioned before that, some of these collections that have gone out of state, have been identified as coming from old caves, but can you explain a little bit more about how we might know that and how we date these sites using pottery?
Oh, okay. So the collections that went out of state, the information we have, I mean, the Gilcrease collection, for example, was one that I just kind of happened upon. Well, actually, Gilcrease wrote to my wife about they had this collection and they wanted to know more about it. And so she provided them with some information, but that was our first kind of clue that they had a collection from old caves. I called the Milwaukee Public Museum, for example, and asked them if they had collections, because we had the report on their work at the site. And this Don Chertome, who I've cited in my acknowledgements as the collections manager, I called her up and, or emailed her actually, and she wrote back that they had one artifact from old caves, and it was a hammerstone, which is basically a rock with some battering on the edge of it. I wrote her back and I said, gosh, of all the things to collect from old caves, that's pretty surprising. And she wrote back and said, yeah, it is. He usually collected potsherds. So we are trying to trace these. I've checked to see if I haven't checked to see if the Smithsonian has collections from the site, but that's something I'd like to pursue. With regard to the dating the sites using pottery, basically pottery styles changed in much the way that car designs, change. And just like you can recognize a 1950s car, and you can recognize a 1960s car, and so forth. And you see how the fins appear and disappear. Pottery changes in sort of that same way. And so some sites will have one style of pottery on them, and another site will have a different style of pottery on them. And then you can date the site based on things like radiocarbon dating or tree ring dating, and you can come up with the date at which these pottery styles, each of these pottery styles, was being manufactured. And we've actually worked that down here in the Southwest. We can look at an assemblage of pottery and say we've got these several styles, and we know this style dates to this time period, and this style dates to another time period, and they overlap during this one time period. And you're able to, in many cases, date a site to within 50 years of when it was occupied, or to a 50-year period during which it was occupied.
Wow, that's pretty accurate,
Yeah.
for pottery. Well,
it's actually the envy of archaeology worldwide.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are more advanced in that in the Southwest than anywhere in the world.
Go Southwest. Well, I want to thank you for your time, Dennis. This has been a great show. To all of the folks watching, this is going to go up on our YouTube. You can watch it if you only caught part of it or missed it. Feel free to join in later. For future shows, just remember you can put in your question underneath the video on our website, scifest2020.org. Dennis, Kelly, great to have you. And big thank you out to Morgan, our engineer, and Paul and Joelle, who is our backup host, hiding in the background, helping me out. So thank you, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you all. Good night.